Greetings, YouTubers. In this edition, we're going to discuss Social Security, and this is a program that you will find very few Republicans and Democrats who they want to reform it. Now, if they don't reform it, they're going to have to, if they don't raise the payroll taxes connected to that, which, by the way, those payroll taxes increased just for Social Security well over 300% from 1950 to 1975, and they've even increased significantly from 1975 to today, although they haven't been raised since the elder Bush was in office back in the early 90s. So if they don't raise the payroll taxes, they're going to have to raise the retirement age way up to at least 70 or more, which will make those Bernie Sanders supporters real happy, because then if they actually do work, you'll have to see the retirement age raised significantly. You're going to see benefits cut even more. In one of my previous videos, I covered the fact that a Social Security recipient in 1980 was getting over $2 adjusted for inflation relative to what they contributed, and today, by 2010, that was down to about 93 cents per dollar. So they've cut it down. What they did in the 60s and 70s is they bought votes. LBJ in his Congress, Richard Nixon in his Congress bought votes by massively increasing the benefits. So if you retired in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, you won the lottery. Now, if you retired after 2010, not so much. So we go over the ratios connected to Social Security. And the reason they publish these ratios is Grandpa is being paid with your money. So if you're working right now and Grandpa's at home enjoying his retirement, or has been for some years, or maybe Grandpa's not around anymore, unfortunately, but did collect Social Security for a long time, you were paying for that. And the reason they publish these ratios is because it's a Ponzi scheme. It's pretty obvious. Now, we'll go over the labor force participation rate later, but just keep these ratios in mind. Look how it was really high in the 40s and 50s, but even after that it began to tail off. Into the 60s and 70s it was much lower than it was in the 50s. Let's see what it is. And in the 80s, it was lower than it was in the 60s, and then it began to level off at about 3.3. And keep in mind, even when these payroll taxes were significantly increased connected to this, and we had our higher worker employee to retiree ratio, the program was still bleeding red in the late 60s and early 70s, as we'll also go over. And you see now it's fallen. Now, why has the ratio fallen so much? Part of the reason, one, Social Security disability, which we'll go over reforming that in detail later. Social Security disability started in 1956. The funny thing is, it wasn't until the 1970s where these rolls really started growing. But the labor force participation rate over the last 20 years has fallen significantly from what it was in the 50s and 60s, especially for men. For women, it leveled off. It reached its high water mark in the mid-90s to the early aughts, and now it's slowly fallen. Well, labor force participation rates for men, 25 to 54, have fallen dramatically from their level in the 50s and 60s. Our birth rate has also declined massively from the 50s and 60s. Post-World War II baby boom, aka the baby boomers, since 1965, our birth rate is way down. So we've got a lot of people who went on disability, and they didn't have a lot of people not having as many kids. The problem also, I went over in other videos many times. If you follow these, this is all review. The out-of-wedlock birth rate has skyrocketed from the level it was in the 40s and 50s. So we have, and if you were raised by a single parent, that doesn't mean you're doomed. But every child needs a father, and we see, especially in the black community, they have destroyed themselves. So you can see those ratios. And Social Security was failing, bleeding red ink in the late 60s and early 70s. OASDI and the disability portion of it, even while we had an incredibly high ratio of employees to retirees. So look at that. 5.1 in 1960, 4.0 in 1965, and 3.7 in 1970, which is a lot higher than it is today at 2.8. And in about 10 years, we're going to be down to about 2 to 1, especially if the labor force participation rate continues to plummet. And a lot of baby boomers did go on disability. They were a good chunk of those. Let's look at this real quick. Average labor force participation rate for men 25 to 54 in the 1950s averaged 97.136%. Average labor force participation rate men 25 to 54 in the 1960s 96.652%. So you can see that's really high. Even after disability was offered in 1956, the labor force participation rate stayed high. We'll go over how that began to change. And Jimmy Carter and his Democrat Congress tried to address the problem. And of course, there was wailing and gnashing of teeth when some people saw their gravy train taken away. And Reagan and his Democrat House and Republican Senate reformed it again to make it easier to get on disability. Labor force participation rate men 25 to 54, 1982 through 1989, 93.801%. So the cracks are starting to show. Average labor force participation rate men 25 to 54 years old, 1994 to 2001, 91.7%. Average labor force participation rate men 25 to 54 2010 through 2015, 88.578%. So keep that in mind as you see that Social Security was getting in big trouble back in the late 60s and early 70s, even with that high rate. So now that we're getting close to 12% of men 25 to 54 aren't even in the labor force, got some big problems. So Social Security, what I'm arguing for, and I'll go through at the end, is partial and eventually full privatization of it. But you're going to have a lot of people who are bipolar who don't want that. A lot of people who have a gravy train don't want that. Taxpayer-funded gravy train, of course. Predictably, the so-called disability was expanded to include a bunch of idiots who weren't disabled. They're just lazy. Average labor force participation rate men 25 to 34 years of age. In the 1950s, it was 97.2%. It was the same in the 1960s. Average labor force participation rate men 25 to 34 years of age, 1982 through 1989, 94.5%. Average labor force participation rate men 25 to 34 years of age, 1994 to 2001, 93%. Average labor force participation rate men 25 to 34 years of age, 2010 through 2015, 89.2%. Here's some other information you need. This will be a little disconcerting. From 1996 to 2001, percent of all disabled workers who had so-called musculoskeletal system and connective tissue disability and other, quote, other mental disorders, the percentage of all disabled workers that were in those two categories, one of those two, 48.38%. 48.38%, 1996 to 2001. From 2002 to 2009, percent of all disabled workers who had a musculoskeletal system and connective tissue disability and so-called, quote, other mental disorders, 54.2%. Keep in mind, this is not even an intellectual disability. This is not mental retardation or muscular dystrophy. Well, that's not a mental disorder, but this isn't mental retardation or Down syndrome was what the phrase I was looking for. This is a so-called other mental disorder, which would be like schizophrenia, bipolar, manic depressive. I'm so depressed I can smoke cigarettes all day, but I can't go to work. Stuff like that. That's an other mental disorder. And we'll go over that. You're seeing the screenshots up there, just so people know exactly what we're talking about here. From 2010 to 2014. Percent of all disabled workers, musculoskeletal system and connective tissue disability, and other mental disorders. Now it's 57.3%. So you can see well over half of them are one of those two categories. A lot of people with other mental disorders. Like I said, bipolar, schizo, manic depressive, just a bad state of mind. Again, that's not Down syndrome or mental retardation or anything like that. It's other mental disorders, and you can trace that back to legislation in 1984. From 1996 to 2001, average percent of all disabled workers that were less than 50 years of age, 41.1%. So back then you see we had a sizable majority, well, not a majority, but close to half, a good chunk of all those workers were going to be on disability for about another 16 years before they retired and went on regular Social Security. From 2002 to 2009, average percent of all disabled workers less than 50 years of age, you can see is 34.7%. You can see a lot of them are baby boomers. From 2010 to 2014, because now in that time frame the baby boomers were a lot older and they had begun retiring by 2008. From 2010 to 2014, average percent of all disabled workers less than 50 years of age, 28.6%. So that's our first part. We've got some more things to go over real quick. Now, about those Social Security promises that you hear so much about, and this focuses on one Republican, Mike Huckabee. I remember when Mitt Romney called it a criminal enterprise back in 2008. And then when Rick Perry was criticizing it in 2012, Mitt Romney and Michelle Bachmann were all over him like white on rice. And Donald Trump and Mike Huckabee and most Republicans, they talk about, well, they've paid into this Ponzi scheme and they're promised this and they're going to get this. Well, you're probably not going to get that due to what, it's pretty well known. Section 1104 of the Social Security Act of 1935 says specifically, the right to alter, amend, or repeal any provision of this act is hereby reserved to the Congress. So what's going to happen in the 60s and 70s, as I said, when they were buying votes and ramping up the benefits for this, because we had a higher ratio of employees to retirees back then, now they've seen the birth rate fall, the labor force participation rate fall, and fewer people paying as much in for various reasons. Plus, people are living a lot longer now. But either way, what Congress is going to do is what they've been doing for the last 20 years, slowly cranking down the benefits, and they're going to get cranked down even more in less than 20 years on our current trajectory. So those of you who are going to be retired in 20 years, get ready to bite the bullet, because Congress is going to crank down on these, because there's no other way to do it. Like I said, they'll raise the retirement age. That'll go over like a turd in the punch bowl. They'll cut benefits. That'll, again, go over like a turd in the punch bowl. And they'll raise payroll taxes. And, part of it is they're going to raise payroll taxes on everybody, but then, the rich. I noticed it was part of the Democrat platform in 2016. Those who, you make over $250,000, you're going to pay more. Well, are they going to increase those people's benefits? No. They're using it as a redistribution of income program, because FDR didn't set up that way. It was a supplement. Well, now the Democrats want to use it to redistribute gobs of income, and as we'll find out too later, those who are in the lower echelons, like McStupid, the janitor from Chicago, those people get a little more bang for their buck, but even they're going to get hit. So, the Supreme Court revisited the issue of Social Security's promises in Fleming versus Nestor, in which Nestor, who had paid into Social Security for 19 years and begun to receive benefits, was then deported for previous ties to the Communist Party. Nestor tried to appeal the termination of his benefits, citing his previous contributions, but the Supreme Court upheld it, saying, to engraft, this is important, listen, to engraft upon the Social Security system a concept of accrued property rights would deprive it of the flexibility. That means we have the flexibility to cut your benefits, and boldness in adjustment to ever-changing conditions like the lower labor force participation rate, lower birth rate, which it demands. It is apparent that the non-contractual interests of an employee covered by the Social Security Act cannot be soundly analogized to that of the holder of an annuity, whose right to benefits is bottomed on his contractual premium payment. So in other words, you're going to get shafted. So Mike Huckabee was playing to the lowest common denominator on that. And my reform plan that I'll go over at the very end won't affect people age 50 and over, should something like that pass. So, in Helvering versus Davis, the court held that Social Security was not a contributory insurance program in the sense that the proceeds of both the employee and the employer taxes are paid in the Treasury like any other internal revenue generally, and they're not earmarked in any way. Despite how Huckabee and his fellow defenders of the status quo describe the program, the payroll tax payments a person pays into Social Security have no direct link to the benefits that they receive in a legal sense. They are subject to future changes made by Congress and dependent on the program having sufficient revenue, which it does not have. The promises with Social Security always come with an asterisk, and beneficiaries are not entitled to a certain amount because they've contributed payroll taxes. In the past, the law has been altered to change the deal facing beneficiaries, and there will undoubtedly have to be more changes in the future if Social Security is to remain viable. So in other words, if someone tells you this program's viable, they're either ignorant or lying. If we maintain the status quo and do nothing, benefits will have to be cut by 23% across the board when the combined trust fund is exhausted in 2034. There can be disagreements, and there will, about the best way to reform Social Security, but when it is facing trillions in unfunded obligations and the certainty of drastic cuts in the future, absent reform, doing nothing is not a feasible option. Of course, when the Democrats want to do something, they will raise payroll taxes on people who make over 250 grand, raise payroll taxes on everybody, cut benefits for everybody. Maybe they'll be gutsy enough to go with a, we're going to raise retirement age. Well, you Bernie Sanders supporters that don't want to work already, if you have to work till 70, wow. And here's, just quickly, we'll go over the cash income, outgo, and balances of the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. We're focusing on Social Security, OASDI, the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Fund, and SSDI, the Disability Insurance Fund. And as you can see, as I said, remember, from 1950 to 1975, the payroll taxes connected to Social Security increased by well over 300%. Congress was raising them regularly. The employee to retiree ratio was high. Yet, in the mid-70s to the early 80s, that program, and OASDI started in 1976, it got in big trouble and went all the way to 1983. It was bleeding tons of red ink. And the Disability Insurance Fund, basically the same scenario. From the mid-70s to the early 80s, it started running out of money. It was 1976. So even back then, and the Disability Insurance Fund didn't have that every year. It was sporadic. But the cracks were already starting even back then. And of course, under a grand budget deal early in Reagan's presidency in his first term, raised them again. And then the last time they were raised under Bush's dad. And guess what? Here we are now. And they knew this even before Clinton got out of office. They knew this deluge of baby boomers, along with the falling labor force participation rate, was going to force somebody's hand. They even knew back then it's been on a bad trajectory for a long time. And as soon as the baby boomers started retiring, the problems started again. Okay, and here's our last part. We're going over some of the reasons SSDI is in trouble, Social Security Disability, as I went over before. 57% of the people on it are on for musculoskeletal or connective tissue. Oh, my back hurts, or other mood disorder, bipolar, which I know there's a lot of Democrats out there who have issues, but that doesn't mean you can dig into my pocket. Bipolar, manic depressive, schizo, and crap like that. It was a noble goal when they started Social Security Disability, but it's not going to people who are legitimately like paralyzed, or veterans who had a limb blown off because Obama had a surge in Afghanistan, much like Bush, or something like that. It's not for people like that. It's people who are able to work but choose not to, and of course it used to be for people 50 years old. But here we go. As originally designed, SSDI benefits were intended for disability insured Americans ages 50 to 65 who were deemed unable to engage in a substantial gainful activity by reason of any medically determinable physical or mental impairment, which must be expected to result in death or to be continued and indefinite duration. And these changes began in 1960 with the removal of the minimum age requirement. In 1965, the temporal factor was altered such that a disability had to be expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. So you can see how they started to open the door then under LBJ. And even Eisenhower. Eisenhower signed legislation starting disability, the disability portion of it, and he started to wreck it even before he left office, and then LBJ put the finishing touches on it. As you'll see, this has opened the door. In 1967, the definition was again revised to clarify that an SSDI applicant is to be found disabled only if his physical or mental impairment, we'll get into the mental impairment part. I realize there are a lot of mentally impaired Democrats, so that doesn't mean you get to sit at home and do nothing. Only if his physical or mental impairment or impairments are of such severity that he is not only unable to do his previous work but cannot, considering his age, education, our public education system must not be doing a good job, and work experience, engage in any other kind of substantial gainful work which exists in the national economy, regardless of whether a specific job vacancy exists for him or whether he would be hired if he applied for work. Important change. The number of SSDI beneficiaries nearly doubled during the 70s, rising from 2.67 million in 1970 to 4.78 million in 1979. In reaction to this eligibility and benefit expansion, in 1980, the Democrat Congress and Jimmy Carter mandated that continuing disability reviews of SSDI beneficiaries be conducted at least once every 3 years because, as I went over, the program was in serious trouble. After that, the number of beneficiaries actually declined 18% within 5 years, falling from 4.68 million in 1980 to 3.82 million in 1984. But as you can see, some people saw their gravy train going away, so there was wailing and gnashing of teeth. And then they enacted amendments to the Social Security Act intended to liberalize the eligibility criteria in 1984 under Reagan, his Democrat House, and Republican Senate. The revisions, this is very important, the revisions included expanding the list of health conditions such as psychiatric conditions recognized as contributing to medical impairment and vocational disability, permitting applications to be considered based on the combined effect of multiple non-severe impairments instead of only those with at least one severe impairment, and assigning more weight to the opinions of treating physicians than evaluating physicians. Since the passage of those eligibility criteria expansions, the SSDI rolls have nearly tripled, and they more than doubled from 1996 to 2014. So that's very important. Again, more than doubled from 1996 to 2014, and the percentage of those on it for so-called mood disorders and musculoskeletal or connective tissue, those people rose much faster than the rolls themselves. So, in an attempt to curtail the growing backlog of SSDI applicants, this is important too, that was caused by a significant rise in applications in the early aughts, the SSA announced its intention to increase administrative law judge productivity to 500 to 700 decisions annually in October 2007. This aim clearly emphasizes the quantity and not the quality. Imagine that. And the SSDI rolls continued to explode. Imagine that. Additionally, since 2007, the percentage of SSDI applications that were approved has actually declined from 37.6% in 2007 to 32.2% in 2014. This is likely, at least in part, attributable to an increase in applications filed by individuals seeking disability benefits primarily for economic rather than medical reasons. And a lot of the older ones will do it for economic reasons. And here we've got the part of the reason a lot of people, especially in the lower echelons, once they get on SSDI, don't go back to work is because the growth in disability insurance and SSDI benefits has outstripped the growth in low-wage jobs. So it's no surprise that if you pay people not to work, you will have a lot of people who do not work. Considering that the average monthly benefit to disabled workers increased by 46% between December 2000 and December 2013. Disability benefits have become more lucrative for less educated, low-skilled workers like McStupid, the janitor, relative to low-wage jobs. In a 2003 Quarterly Journal of Economics article, David Autor and Mark Duggan concluded that the replacement rate of low-wage earners rose more quickly than that of middle and high-wage earners from 1979 to 1999. The wage and disability benefit growth data presented here suggests that this trend has continued into the 21st century. This high demand for federal DI benefits is unlikely to change until their value is exceeded by the rewards for labor market participation. So you raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and any chance that a lot of these people have of going back to work will basically go out the window, because you are not going to get paid $15 an hour to do mundane tasks. No offense, but you will not get paid. You will not get paid $15 an hour to run a cash register and sweep a floor. Period. So here's the legislation from 1980, and we'll go over this real quickly, that Carter signed from a Democrat Congress. Section 311, periodic review of disability determinations, and they were addressing the explosion of the disability rolls in the 70s, because some people were gaming the system, and by golly, it helped to fix the problem, but there was a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth because of some people were losing their gravy train. So they, for purposes of continuing eligibility at least once every 3 years, except that where such a finding has been made that such disability is permanent, such as a severe brain injury or paralysis. Social Security Disability Amendments of 1980. This is a Social Security Administration article. Revisions. This is the 1980 legislation. Revisions to the DI benefit structure that were signed into law. During the early 1970s, the disability incidence rates, we've been over this, the number of disability awards in relation to the insured population increased significantly and resulted in substantial increases in the cost of the disability program. In its 1973 report, the Board of Trustees of the Social Security Trust Funds noted the significant increase in the cost of the DI program resulting from higher disability incidents. The trustees stated if the trend of higher disability rates continued, the resultant cost increase of the disability program would be of sufficient magnitude to require additional financing. So even back then, in the 1973 report, they saw the handwriting on the wall. The Titanic was sinking. So, and my little note there, it also tried to address this 1980 legislation, roadblocks to putting people back to work. And two of the roadblocks that are unemployment insurance cost to employer levied by the state and Washington, and two, minimum wage or prevailing wage law, which I already mentioned. You raise that to $15 an hour, and those people who are on disability will probably never go back to work. This is Carter's legislation, eligibility of aliens for SSI benefits. This proposal would make a sponsor's agreement of support legally binding for 5 years, authorize legal action to secure reimbursement of public assistance paid to newly arrived aliens, and provide that aliens who receive unreimbursed public assistance would be regarded as public charges and subject to possible deportation. Ooh, Jimmy Carter, quite tough on illegal aliens getting on the gravy train. So, here's an important one. Closed evidentiary record. The introduction of new evidence is prohibited in OASDI and SSI claims after a decision on the claim is made at the hearings level in order to stabilize the record on a claim prior to appeals counsel or federal court review. This provision is intended to limit the so-called floating application process, very important, whereby a claimant, usually an applicant for disability benefits, continues to introduce new evidence while the appealed claim is being reviewed. Very important there. They were trying to cut down on fraud. Now we're moving to the 1984 legislation signed by Reagan, passed by a Republican Senate and a Democrat House. Permits the Secretary of HHS to terminate a beneficiary's entitlement to Social Security, to SSDI, or Supplemental Security Income, disabled or blind benefits, or Medicare benefits based on the disability of an individual, or to determine that a period of disability has ended on the basis that the impairment has ceased, no longer exists, or is not disabling, or if there is substantial evidence of at least one of the following. And it goes through all these caveats here, and I'll let you read those for yourself just to move this along a little bit. Evaluation of pain. This is one of the reasons the disability rolls have increased massively. What's called the evaluation of pain, and making it easier for people to get on disability. And I know if you question this, then you're a hater and you hate people and you hate disabled people and all that. And that's what's allowed a lot of these people for, oh, I got some back pain, to get on there. If you read through all this. Here's the multiple impairments section we talked about earlier. If the combined effect of multiple impairments is determined to be severe, the combined effect will be considered throughout the sequential evaluation process, effective for determinations made on or after December 1st, 1984. Moratorium on mental impairment reviews. We'll see this later. A lot of governors got involved in this, basically forcing Congress's hand, because they decided we're not going to review any of these cases anymore per the Carter-era legislation. We're not going to review these. We're just going to basically wait for Congress to act and give us what we want. And I think if more of this was left to the states, we wouldn't see this problem, but everything's been federalized. And, of course, it all started when the Supreme Court said, you know what, Social Security is conducive to the general welfare. And, you know, I don't agree with that. And, of course, eventually a broadband internet connection, and, of course, health care, and probably a car and housing, and everything else is a right, which means, you know, basically if someone doesn't have the money to pay for it, you will pay for it. So people have the freedom to destroy their lives by having children they can't take care of or abusing drugs, and you get to pay for that. Out-of-wedlock births are no longer a problem for the family. They are a problem for the taxpayer. So moratorium on mental impairment reviews delays periodic review of mentally impaired individuals, bipolar, schizo, manic depressive, until criteria for evaluating mental disorders are revised to realistically evaluate, ambiguous language alert, the ability of a mentally impaired person to engage in SGA in a competitive workplace. That's substantial gainful activity. Requires the revised criteria to be published in regulations within 120 days after enactment. A notice of proposed rulemaking was published on February 4th, 1985. So these rules were passed by bureaucrats, which got together with certain psychologists and said, you know what, I think this person's a bipolar and a manic depressive, and they just can't work, so we better get them on disability. So was not sanctioned by Congress. There's, again, administrative lawmaking, which has been a problem long before this legislation came down the pike. The provision reflects the concern of Congress that some claims involving mental impairments were not adjudicated properly in the last few years, and that the criteria for evaluating mental impairments require updating to make them consistent with present-day diagnosis, treatment, and evaluation of mental impairments. Before enactment of this provision, this is the 1984 legislation again, SSA had reviewed only a small percentage of disability cases, about 150,000 a year. And that's why they wanted to start reviewing these, because there's a potential that there's a lot of fraud. And again, it also mentions the rapid growth in the benefit rolls in the 70s. So they started reviewing more of these cases. And people got mad. People threw a little hissy fit over it. Disability standards and mental impairment cases. This is where the courts get involved. Mental Health Association of Minnesota versus Heckler, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, ordered SSA, this is a region-wide class action, ordered SSA to cease using a standard for evaluating the disabilities of mentally ill claimants that presumed that a person retained the capacity to perform unskilled work if he was under age 50 and had an impairment that did not meet the criteria for a mental impairment in the listing of impairments in the regulations. So, excuse me. So we'll just adjust those impairments via rulemaking, and voila, we've got you on disability. So, and he ended up with a lot more younger workers getting, and a lot of these were the baby boomers in the 80s, getting on disability for a mental disorder. And here we've got the example I'll quickly go about through. Many governors took action to make sure CDR's continuing disability reviews were brought to a screeching halt. The courts are also guilty of allowing this mental illness junk science to be used to pad the SSDI rule. So a whole bunch of governors, Dukakis, failed governor, old slick Willie Clinton, so all these governors in New York, West Virginia, North Carolina, Illinois, Idaho, Texas, it was just a deluge of governors that said, you know what, we're not going to have any more CDR reviews or terminations until Congress gives us what we want. And then you can see why the SSDI rules have continued to skyrocket. Just because you're depressed and you're an emo goth doesn't mean you can sit around and not work. I would also highly recommend, there's a link up there, I've just put the screenshot up there, Stephen Molyneux's view. I urge you to watch the whole video. I see a lot of people commenting on that video who haven't watched the whole thing. And he asked one question in there. When someone is diagnosed, among many questions, when someone is diagnosed with schizophrenia, what actual physical empirical tests do they perform? Blood tests, x-rays, brain scans, none. It's all observance of behavior. And, oh, well, you're on mental health, you're on disability, you're on SSDI. So he asks a lot of questions in there and goes over a lot of depressing information about all these people who are on mood-altering drugs and antipsychotics. We really do live in a nation of victims. So I urge you to watch that video. Here's a little more on the Reagan-era legislation passed in 1984. Specifically, we've already gone through Section 5 and Section 8. An initial determination under subsection A. This is a lot of lingo. A lot of baloney. Qualifications of mental... We've already been over Section 5, moratorium on mental impairment reviews. But here's a specific part in Section 8. An initial determination under subsection that an individual is not under a disability in any case where there is evidence which indicates the existence of a mental impairment shall be made only if the Secretary has made every reasonable effort to ensure that a qualified psychiatrist or psychologist has completed the medical portion of the case review and any applicable residual functional capacity assessment. So you see how that's when they allowed, that was when the floodgates were open for mental disorder evaluations, and I think America is, this is a part of a larger issue. A lot of fatherless children, a lot of people having children that can't take care of them. I believe people have the freedom to use drugs and should, because I don't think the government has the authority constitutionally to tell you what you can and can't put in your system. There's a lot of progressives that agree with that, but they're pro-choice on drugs and abortion. But when it comes to health care, education, trade, light bulbs, Walmart, unionization, stuff like that, they're not. So they're quite the hypocrites. So hopefully that information helps you, and maybe you can write your senators and representatives, although we will be up against some well-heeled so-called social welfare organization, progressive social welfare organizations that want to keep this gravy train going. And I think a lot of it's the problem with the public school system has done a poor job, and a lot of the parents, and they know who they are, have done a poor job. A lot of baby mamas, a lot of baby daddies that don't take care of their kids, and then they wonder why their kids grow up to be idiots and have all these emotional problems and disorders. So use this information, write your senators, write your representatives. Oh, lastly, what I would do to reform Social Security, say it gets passed, let's say it gets passed on February 1st of whatever year. The first full calendar year after it begins, if you're between age 40 and 49, you can divert, this is just for the employee side, 10% of your Social Security FICA payroll taxes into a 401k or Roth IRA. Or you can take it as cash and go snort it up your nose. I don't care, because I trust you with your money better than Washington. If you're between age 30 and 39, you could divert 1/4. If you're between age 20 and 29, you can divert 1/2. Anybody over 50 will stay in the system as is, and we will make sure that you can get inflation-adjusted COLA increases by cutting spending elsewhere, such as getting rid of federal departments that are unconstitutional and ineffective, like education, Federal Department of Education, HUD, and our parasitical relationship with NATO. Quit having military bases in Japan and South Korea, which are totally able to defend themselves. Get rid of the nuclear triad, to where if we have to deliver nuclear missiles and wipe somebody off the face of the earth, we can do that just via submarines instead of having submarines, bombers, and land-based launchers. Anybody under age 20 at the time that act is passed, the first full calendar year, can get an inflation-adjusted refund and opt out of the program. If they want to stay in the program, they can still divert 50% of their earnings if they want to, or they can just gamble with Social Security if they want. Anybody born in the first full calendar year after that act will be opted out of Social Security. They will be basically funding their retirement on their own instead of having it thieved from a system where Congress can just crank down the benefits if they want and crank up the taxes and determine when you can retire. So it's a lot more freedom. You know, Social Security is such a great program. It's forced upon you because it's so great. So, and for like the employer side, continue that at the current 6.2% rate, and then we could taper that off. Maybe after, I mean, I'm flexible on how it goes. Maybe for 10 years, keep it at the same 6.2% and then reduce it by 10%, so 0.62% every, 5 years until you totally get rid of it. Just taper it off, and we're not going to give them a break any way or the other by hiring a certain worker of a certain age, because that would be discriminatory, and they may hire employees that enter a certain age group to get themselves a break. But that would also help, because then employers, that would reduce the cost of hiring. So basically it comes down to, do you believe in financial freedom for the individual, or do you hate the individual and you think everybody should be a collective and use this Social Security program to redistribute wealth? Because you get out of life what you put in it. And no offense to people who do mundane tasks, but if all you've ever done is mundane tasks, you should not be having kids. And you should not expect a lavish retirement unless you're a heck of a saver. So they like to, the Democrats and progressives especially, and even there are some Republicans like to put us in classes and defend Social Security. It's a Ponzi scheme, and it's corrupt, and you're gonna either see your retirement age jacked up quite a bit in the next 15, 20 years, or you're gonna see benefits cut a lot more, or both, or you're gonna see those payroll taxes raised, and trying to soak the rich to pay for a program to shore this up. I've been over this in videos prior. In the 60s and 70s, when they had these absurdly high income tax rates for millionaires, it wasn't a whole lot higher than they were paying under Reagan and Clinton, but they never balanced the budget once in the 60s and 70s, and that was before the government. The government spending has grown so much since then. They'll never balance the budget. So soaking the rich won't work, and I don't believe in it because it's just not fair. I mean, if you're a janitor from Chicago like McStupid, and you don't make much money, just because someone makes twice as much as you, which would be about $40,000, that doesn't mean they should be taxed at a much higher level. Or if they make millions, it's just not fair. It's class warfare, and that playbook is older than most of these old progressives hanging out on YouTube with nothing better to do. Have a nice day, and don't thank me now for the information.